Hey folks, so now back with mini lecture 3 of this lecture focusing on agriculture and forestry, which you could put together in agroforestry, which I used to work in, agriculture and forestry in the Brazilian Amazon. So we talked about kind of the magnitude of the problems, their global and regional importance, the environmental issues. We learned that also that these are partly driven by globally important commodities of beef and soybeans and their production, expanded production and export from Brazil. We've looked at could intensification of livestock production, for example, be one way to solve the problem. And we saw that there's limited support for that. Kind of a complex relationship between intensification causing an initial upsurge in deforestation followed by some reduction in deforestation, while intensification dairy production did cause a reduction in deforestation associated with dairy. So I'm going to share my screen again to think about, okay, what are the other options that are available? So these were the drivers. So this is, and I'm going to make explicit mention back to something that I covered early in the class, which is the 3 sources of power in agri-food systems. So as we go through these, I'd like you to keep track of this. It's kind of a nice way for me to summarize sort of what's going on, who can and needs to be involved to solve some of these big, thorny and complex problems of agriculture environment interactions. Draw your attention to this article, which is really a nice short summary article in Science magazine by Jeff Tollefson in 2015 on battle for the Amazon. And at that time, it was at a deforestation had been kind of battled down to the level we saw sort of historical low levels in 2012, 2013, compared to previous levels and compared even to current levels. So this is at a time when there really was a large-scale commitment of resources to reducing deforestation in the Amazon. There was support across different government units, and really entailed a battle. So during that time, what Tollefson outlines and others is that there was a lot of involvement by governments. This included the Brazilian federal government, as well as state and to some extent local governments. The federal government, as you said, was involved with these designation of protected and indigenous peoples areas that I mentioned in the last mini lecture. The federal government also was in a position to put pressure on state and local governments. For example, they had a blacklist of counties with high deforestation. So they had some ability to both just kind of name and shame counties that had higher rates of deforestation. And I know that they also put some pressure on state governments by the amount of funding that they provided to state governments to provide incentive for state governments to take deforestation seriously. State governments then had their own responsibilities that varied from state to state and their actions they could take. Part of the actions were just better law enforcement. So there was things like illegal deforestation to actually just enforce the law. And then have prosecutors and courts that enforce those laws. So there was a time when state police would arrest people for illegal deforestation and then find that the courts would give minimal punishments, which were far less than the gains that the companies made by selling these very expensive big trees out of the Amazon. We had improved land registries, so there was kind of clear on who owned what and not sort of a Wild West frontier sense that you could stake a claim to any plot of land just by using it, that there was a clearer and more formalized system of property to land, sort of firming up, in a sense, property rights to land. Another thing that some state governments did was they made the agricultural loans that they provided to be conditional on compliance with environmental laws. So this is an interesting policy tool that we can call cross-compliance. So you link compliance to one thing across to another thing that you are providing. So a service or an opportunity or a subsidy that you're provided to kind of stimulate one and support one type of behavior, you make conditional on something else, which might be negative or positive that you want done. So there was some cross-compliance. Farmers tend to not like cross-compliance, and we've tried cross-compliance approaches here in Canada with not too much success. Here's the story about all of the work that was done to declare many areas to be national parks and indigenous reserves. And so there was a large efforts to do that in the early 2000s. So we see large chunks of land which were then given to be co-managed by local indigenous groups and the federal, sometimes federal and sometimes state governments. So that's the government's role, right? There was a variety of roles, including this cross-compliance, subsidization of inputs and intensification. There was land registries. There's other approaches to land governance with indigenous reserves and national parks. So it's a variety of things they did. Non-governmental organizations, sort of the second source of power, also had a role. Early on, as described by the Tollefson piece, Greenpeace was really important at the international scale in raising awareness about the deforestation that was happening, especially back in that deforestation back in the 2000s, raising awareness, putting pressures on companies that were exporting beef and other companies to not purchase product produced on illegally cleared land, so that there was some land which had been legally cleared according to the law. There's other areas that had been illegally cleared, and that they should be careful about only purchasing products which are produced on legally cleared lands that include beef and soybeans and even leather. Another things that was done by local non-governmental organizations was to be involved in the monitoring, measuring, and publishing and raising awareness about the level of deforestation happening in different parts of the Amazon. So there was a local non-governmental organization that worked hand in hand with the federal space agency that was which was producing these data to then make that data available anywhere in the world. So you could avail that data over the internet in kind of almost real time. Another place that a sort of a non-governmental approach or government to government approach was with the Norway deal with Brazil on reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So this involved a deal. So originally only Norway entered into this bilateral deal with Brazil, that if Brazil could reduce its deforestation rate below historical trends, that government of Norway would make a payment to Brazil of $4 per ton below, so if the deforestation below a certain base, to the extent to which they were below that base, they would get $4 per ton from Norway. So Norway would make that payment to them into the Brazil Forest Fund. This just says that. And you can see in the bottom panel here is what was the observed rate of deforestation beginning in 1988 to 2009, so that 20-year period. And then what the targets that were set for 2010 all the way out to 2017 would kind of march down on that. And to the extent to which they achieved the targets or surpassed the targets, then there would be a payment from the government of Brazil. Other countries came on board to support this, including Germany. So that's a non-governmental sector, and then as well as the government-to-government level of power. And the third source of power in general here is we talk about as the private sector. Two of the initiatives that were undertaken by the private sector. So these were private sector businesses that saw that their shareholders and their customers were worried about deforestation in the Amazon, that they could be kind of turned off the brand if their brand was associated with deforestation. So on the beef side, private app within Brazil, private abattoirs then enacted arrangements with ranchers, so the ranchers that were providing beef into abattoirs, and then the abattoirs then selling cut beef into the supermarket system. So these abattoirs had deals with ranchers that there would be no new deforestation, that any place that was used to graze cattle would be an area that had been deforested sometime before, and they have to agree on kind of what's that baseline. Big food companies like Walmart pledged to avoid sourcing from recent deforestation areas. You can see what they tried to do, and they tried to provide information into the Walmart stores in Brazil. And we can, there's sort of, different takes on how altruistic or how serious that effort actually was by Walmart. There was a finding on that by Holly Gibbs and others here on what about this, these arrangements between the ranchers and the abattoirs. Did they have any effect on reducing deforestation? And this shows in these blue dots. So this is the map of Brazil, the map of the Amazon. You can see the red areas being areas that had been deforested, and blue dots were places where locations of abattoirs that had arrangements, no deforestation arrangements with ranchers, and then the yellow dots are places that didn't have agreements. And Gibbs and colleagues found that there was a lower deforestation rate for those that were registered. So some positive news here about how private companies could change their supply chain, put restrictions on their supply chain to encourage compliance with no deforestation that their suppliers would have. So that's somewhat similar in a sense to the cross-compliance for government services. This is cross-compliance for the ability to sell your commodity into the value chain. So there was a positive or an agreeable effect of that. So I'm just going to stop here, and then the final mini lecture here is going to focus on, so what's happened since? So we had these relative successes, up to about 2015, kind of what's the situation now. So I'll stop sharing.